It started with silence, yeah, but not the kind that soothes. This silence was ancient, buried beneath ice and shadow, the kind that holds its breath as if the earth itself remembered something it was too terrified to speak aloud. Deep in Siberia, beyond the reach of satellites and signals, Kieran Holt stood alone before an obsidian monolith carved with symbols that should not have existed. They weren't shaped by wind or time or human hands, they were etched with intent. And at their heart was a sentence, a joke, 5 words long, a meaningless phrase, if read as it appeared. But nothing about this place was meaningless. Kieran wasn't supposed to be here. He was a failed academic, a linguist mocked for chasing patterns in forgotten scripts and failed punchlines. His obsession with lost humor had made him a ghost in the academic world. But this monumenta was no coincidence. It wasn't ruin. It was a delivery, one aimed at someone just like him, someone who understood that jokes were built on structure, timing, a broken bar, and sometimes hidden warnings. The punchline etched on the stone was clumsy, awkward. I accept it wasn't. Its rhythm didn't match Earth languages, but it did align with the frequency buried inside an ancient radio pulse intercepted by SETI nearly a century ago. Kieran recognized it instantly. He had spent a decade chasing that signal, one dismissed as galactic background noise. But here it was, carved into black stone, waiting. His breath frosted in the air as he leaned closer. He whispered the words out loud, and the stone pulsed on, a soft, red, alive. It was listening. The joke wasn't just a joke, it was a cipher, a countdown embedded in irony, sarcasm, and something older than language. His portable scanner translated the syntax, not in letters, but in time. When it completed the decryption, one phrase blinked back at him from the screen: solar event. 72 hours. Prepare. He froze. His mind recoiled from it, tried to deny it, but the logic unfolded too cleanly. The symbols were not random. They formed a predictive mappa, an exact, mathematically sound warning of a coronal mass ejection from the sun. Not one that might happen, one that would. In 72 hours, Earth's skies would light up not with beauty but with destruction. Grids would fail, satellites would melt, magnetic shields would collapse, civilization would burn from within. But even that wasn't the most terrifying part, because the code hadn't been written for humans, it had been left for humans by something that had seen this happen before, something that knew. This was not the first world to face this, it was simply the next. The message wasn't a courtesy, it was a test, a filter, a final challenge to a species standing on the edge of survival. And in that moment, the man no one listened to, the failed linguist whose theories had become jokes, Themsavasa, understood that he had just become Earth's first and only lifeline, the only person who could read a warning, and perhaps the only one willing to risk being believed. The wind howled across the frozen monument, but Kieran couldn't hear it anymore. The weight of the decoded words was louder than any storm, and behind those words lay something deeper still, an implication that gnawed at his bones. If the joke had been waiting for 1,000 years, a broken bar, how long had they known? That single question dragged him away from the sight, burning in his chest like a second sun. If someone out there had seen this before and had taken the time to leave a joke as a message, it meant 2 things. 1, they were long gone, a broken bar, and 2, they had wanted us to laugh just before we died. But he wasn't going to let the punchline be the end, not when he had 72 hours left. And as he crossed the frozen plains, signal equipment in his backpack coming alive with interference from the rising solar winds, Kieran realized something else, yes, something worse than the flare, worse than the monument, worse than being too late. There was no guarantee anyone would believe him. Not the media, not the government, not even the scientists who once laughed him out of their conferences, because who would trust a warning hidden in a joke? The countdown had begun, but humanity hadn't even noticed the clock. And that's when the first tremor hit, and not from the ground, but from deep space. A ripple of electromagnetic distortion touched Earth's upper atmosphere like a warning breath before the storm. The flare was coming, but the real question wasn't whether Earth could survive the impact. The real question was, what else did the message say that he hadn't decoded yet? Because countdowns don't just warn, they lead to something. And Kieran was about to discover that the joke didn't end at the punchline, it began there. The stars had always whispered. Kieran just never imagined they'd be whispering to him. As he raced down the mountain ridge, snow slicing across his face and the decoded warning burning in his thoughts. Kieran replayed the punchline in his mind, not because it was funny, but because it wasn't. Because there was something off about the phrasing, something too deliberate. The kind of awkwardness that doesn't come from mistranslation, but from design. By the time he reached his makeshift base camp, the satellite modem was already spitting static. Solar interference had begun. The countdown was real, but it was the message behind the warning that gnawed at him. The syntax didn't match any known human language, but it did match something else. It mirrored a pattern in an old archive of SETI transmissions, thought to be cosmic background noise. But that same noise had puzzled Kieran for years, ever since he first heard a burst transmission embedded in LATRA. Yes. Lateral from a deep space anomaly logged in 1997, he thought it was a prank. No one believed him. But now, here it was again, disguised in the structure of the joke, buried in rhythm and beat. It was not a coincidence. This message was alien. It hit him like cold iron against the chest. A civilization had seen this flare coming 1,000 years ago. Either they had technology advanced enough to observe solar patterns across millennia, or they had experienced this before. The code wasn't just scientific, it was emotional. The way it was phrased, the way it was delivered as a joke, it was sent to someone they believed would understand humor. Someone like humans. This wasn't just about warning Earth, it was about testing it. Kieran uploaded the full decoded string to an encrypted server and pinged the only person he knew who might help it, Dr. Arla Vega, a former SETI cryptologist turned underground theorist. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Kieran's theories got him blacklisted. But within minutes, she responded. "I've seen this structure before," she messaged. "It matches a 1982 burst pattern from Messier 53. You're not crazy, but you're not safe either." Then the call dropped. Kieran stood staring at the blinking cursor. Not safe. Why not safe? He turned to his broadcast system and rerouted the signal through low-orbit satellites. If this warning was relevant, he no longer doubted it was. It had to get out. Governments might not act in time. Agencies might bury it, but the people deserved to know. As the system prepared to transmit, he saw something that chilled him more than the flare's approach. A live feed of global radiation levels was already climbing. The sun had begun to change, and no one had noticed. He initiated the stream. On screens around the world, news stations and public feeds were abruptly interrupted. The image was strange. Kieran, standing in front of a diagram of a joke, explaining how the rhythm of its words contained a solar countdown. How a 1,000-year-old alien message was hiding in humor. Most viewers laughed, some panicked, others simply dismissed him. But for those who paid attention, who understood the structure of language and science, what he was saying couldn't be ignored. It fit. The timing matched solar cycle irregularities, the energy spikes already visible in the heliosphere. The message was too precise to be fantasy. Then came the first global blackout. 10% of the planet's low-orbit satellites failed. Electrical grids in rural regions began flickering. Scientists worldwide scrambled to verify the readings. And somewhere deep inside a black site server in Nevada, a red flag was raised on Kieran Holt's name. This wasn't just an eccentric man shouting about aliens anymore. It was real. The message had been received, decoded, verified, and still, the world hesitated, because it didn't come wrapped in authority. It came wrapped in laughter, and no one wanted to admit the end of the world had been foretold in a joke. But the joke wasn't over, because hidden behind the words, behind the flare, behind the warning, a broken bar, there was more. As Kieran stared at the lines of alien syntax, one segment flickered on his screen, a glyph he hadn't noticed before, one that didn't match the flare sequence. It translated to one phrase: "This has happened before." The flare was just the beginning. Something else had survived that last world-ending event, and they had left more than a message. They had left a design, and Kieran was about to discover it hidden in the final line of the punchline, a solution no one believed in, buried beneath the ashes of a warning everyone ignored. There are patterns that speak louder than words, and sometimes when the clock is ticking and the air turns electric, it's not the message that matters most, But who left it behind? The glyph shimmered on Kieran's screen like a breath trapped in frozen time. This has happened before. The phrase echoed louder than any alarm, not just a warning, a record, a memory. And if this truly was a historical account encoded inside the DNA of a dying civilization's final communication, then Earth wasn't alone in facing this fate. The solar flare wasn't some rare, freak event. It was a cosmic rhythm, a pulse that had burned other worlds before us, and some alien culture that once watched their sky collapse had chosen not to scream, but to laugh, not because it was funny, because it was all they had left. As Kieran dug deeper into the punchline, the syntax shift morphed into something almost elegant, crystalline in design. What appeared to be poetic noise was actually structured metadata, a full schematic, coordinates, instructions for manipulating Earth's own magnetic fields, not theory, not guesswork, technology. But it wasn't written in a way a physicist would read it up. It was encrypted through cadence, through irony, through satire. This wasn't just language, it was a lock designed to be opened only by a species capable of understanding humor and logic, and humanity had passed that test barely. The weight of it all nearly crushed Kieran. In one moment, he realized Earth had been handed not just a death sentence, but a key. The alien punchline wasn't merely a countdown up, it was a blueprint for survival. He uploaded the schematic to a trusted dark web science forum under an anonymous handle and tagged it with a phrase that would summon the right kind of minds: reverse-lensed planetary shield architecture and accelerated peer input. Now, within an hour, responses exploded. Impossible tech, but terrifyingly elegant. If this is real, it would bend magnetosphere orientation artificially. Holy hell, this would work. Whoever designed these broken bar wasn't human. Then came a private message from someone using a quantum encrypted address: "You've drawn attention. They'll come for the design. Be ready to move." At that exact moment, Kieran's generator surged, lights blew out, equipment sparked. The flare's first whispers were becoming screams, but he didn't stop, because somewhere in that design was a narrow window, a margin of activation. 40 hours. The artificial shield could redirect enough of the incoming solar burst to prevent atmospheric annihilation, but only if deployed across a geostationary satellite network and only if Earth's power grids could be harnessed in time. He didn't need to convince the governments, he just needed to reach the ones who could act faster than government: the private engineers, the orbital manufacturers, the space cowboys who built hardware in deserts and launched CubeSats without permits. He activated the broadcast node again. The second message was different. No more analysis, no more theories. He faced the camera and simply said, "This isn't fiction. A solar flare is coming in less than 70 hours. I have proof, and a plan to stop it." The blueprint wasn't human, but the solution will be. Then he shared the alien schematic, live, all of it, no restrictions. And that's when the true panic began, not from civilians, but from agencies. Intelligence networks scrambled, power grids were quietly rerouted. SpaceX, Orbital Vantage, and rogue tech groups began pulling archive satellites out of cold storage. Nations weren't ready to respond, but the builders, the doers, the quiet geniuses, they were. The blueprints spread like fire across digital space. And somewhere in an underground NATO facility, a commander whispered to his aide, "We didn't make contact with aliens. We were tested by them. And we almost failed." But failure wasn't sealed yet, because even as the sun's outer corona began to bulge, even as the sky shimmered in invisible tension, Earth's strange chorus of rogue thinkers and unsung engineers were preparing a defense written in the grammar of irony and forged by desperate brilliance. But as Kieran watched data streams light up from Brazil to Belgium, from underground hacker bunkers to orbital assembly rings, he couldn't help but notice something strange in the alien punchline: a second layer, one he hadn't yet translated. And something about that final stanza made his blood run cold, because the last sentence wasn't about the flare at all. It was about what came after. It began as static, barely a whisper through the noise of collapsing networks and failing satellites, but within that static, Kieran could hear it, a pattern, a beat, a rhythm like breath held under tension. It wasn't human, not anymore. The second layer of the alien punchline had nothing to do with solar flares or radiation belts. It was a postscript, a broken bar, or perhaps, a prophecy, one so deeply embedded in sarcasm, metaphor, and structure that it took Kieran's collapsing sanity to finally see it. The message didn't just warn of Earth's destruction, it warned of what would come to see if we survived. And as the world above him burned brighter with each passing hour, Kieran realized the flare was never the final event, it was the filter, an interstellar crucible designed to test which civilizations were capable of surviving not just the fury of a star, but the burden of knowing they had been watched while doing it. Somewhere deep beneath a decommissioned European weather station, converted in haste into a shield algorithm hub, Kieran stood before the servers pulsing with the weight of human ingenuity. Civilizations across Earth had come together in unprecedented speed. Chinese quantum technicians were on encrypted calls with American theorists. Space elevator hubs in Kenya were reactivated for satellite lift. Even hardened defense networks had gone silent, and not in ignorance, but in obedience. Because now, even the doubters had seen it. The data matched. The flare was accelerating, and the only viable counter was the alien solution Kieran had brought screaming from the dark. But he couldn't focus on the engineering anymore. That part was being handled by minds greater and faster than his. What haunted him now was the shape of the message, its cruel humor. The second layer was no joke. It was a warning written in satire. If they understand the first part, tell them we're already on our way. It wasn't phrased as a threat, it was a challenge, a statement of intent. Kieran sat alone inside the shielding bunker, a smaller piece piping him into the global launch coordination network. Voices from 20 countries float into one-time linear deployment paths, shield frequencies, heat absorption tolerances. The world was moving, but his eyes stayed locked on the glyph glowing on his hull screen. A single word translated as awakening, because according to the alien syntax, surviving the flare wasn't the end of the message, it was the trigger. He stepped outside the bunker briefly, ignoring the radiation alerts screaming in his HUD. The sky was sickly gold, the sun bloated like it had swallowed fire, the air tingled, drones zipped across the sky like insects scattering before a storm. High above, shield satellites were aligning, synchronized to the alien harmonic frequencies embedded in the punchline's blueprint, each one activated in sequence, forming a hexagonal shell that trapped Earth in light-up and irony. Still, it wasn't enough. Kieran stared at the sun, blinking behind protective lenses. The light wasn't just brighter, it was alive. It felt like something was watching from inside it, as if the flare itself carried memory, or worse, conscious design. Maybe the flare wasn't natural. Maybe it never had been. His comms buzzed. Shield activation complete. Primary field integrity holding at 84%. Estimated mitigation success, 73%. The room cheered behind him. Engineers wept. Generals shook hands. But Kieran didn't celebrate. He stepped back into the control room, his voice cutting through the moment. Have we received any new frequencies since activation? A pause. Then one technician replied, hesitating, yes, sir. Ultra-low bandwidth signal detected in the 6.2 Hz range. Extremely faint. Repeating sequence. He already knew. He didn't wait. He rushed to the translator, input the waveform manually, and let the alien decryption protocols run against the message. One phrase emerged. 5 words, we see you. Prepare reception. The message had changed. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a response. He looked around at the stunned room of faces that moments ago were basking in survival, now frozen by realization. Earth hadn't just survived the test. It had signaled back. The flare was the key. And now the door was open. Outside, the sky trembled, and not from light, but from movement. A ripple passed through the upper atmosphere. Not natural, not Earth-made. They were coming, and the countdown wasn't over. It had just restarted. It was supposed to be over. Humanity had survived. The planetary shield, built from alien blueprints hidden in a 1,000-year-old joke, held strong as the solar flare slammed into Earth's upper atmosphere. Fires burned across the sky, but they did not consume the ground. Power grids faltered but recovered. Satellites staggered in orbit but did not fall. The planet shook but it stood. Cheers erupted from bunkers and broadcast centers alike. Billions believed they had lived through the end. But Kieran Holt didn't cheer. He stood silently, watching the real-time solar telemetry stream as the flare's energy wave began to recede. It wasn't relief in his eyes, it was dread, because as the electromagnetic storm ebbed, something else came through, a something hidden in the radiation, something that did not come from the Sunday. It wasn't the second wave of fire, it was a signal. It piggybacked on the tail end of the flare, using frequencies that couldn't be traced to any known celestial behavior. Deep, pulsing, methodical, alien by every definition. The same joke that had warned humanity was now being answered, not in sarcasm or metaphor, but in presence. Kieran watched the instruments go from silent to saturated in seconds. The signal hit Earth satellites first, hijacking long-dead transponders, some of which hadn't been used in over 30 years. Then came the Earth-based receivers, satellite dishes, abandoned observatories, underground fiber tunnels. All began blinking with unreadable pulses. But the pattern wasn't new. It was a match identical to the second-layer glyph he'd barely translated before the flare arrived. A phase not meant to terrify, but to announce, "Prepare reception." Kieran's blood ran cold. The alien message had always been more than a warning. It was a test of fitness, of survivability. But the prize wasn't just survival, it was contact. For 1,000 years, Earth had been on a silent timer, a civilization not yet visited, but watched, observed, judged. And now, having survived the crucible of fire with alien knowledge as its crutch, Earth had proven itself, not by choice, by design. But what kind of beings would design such a trial? Kieran stared into the static, now crawling across every screen in the relay hub. Buried deep in that chaos, a new symbol emerged, the one he had never seen before. Circular, fractal, but with a distinct human mimicry. A response, yes, but not a warm one. Not a message of peace, a declaration. Something was inbound, and not just metaphorically. Global telescopes locked onto a disturbance far beyond Pluto, a distortion in gravity, an absence of light where there should have been stars. For years, scientists had speculated about interstellar void ships, vessels so vast they warped space-time. But now, the warp wasn't a theory, it was on approach. Kieran issued one final global alert. They're coming. We passed their test, but we don't know what that means. I don't think we were meant to win. I think we were meant to survive long enough for them to arrive. The world fell quiet again. And then, the lights flickered across every screen, every device still operational. The same phrase scrolled in every major Earth language. Your humor was a broken bar acceptable. Now we will see your truth. Panic rippled across continents. Some hailed it as first contact. Others called it an invasion. But Kieran knew better. This wasn't war, not yet. It was evaluation. The fire was just the entrance exam. Tease a broken bar. This was the interview. And as Earth's defense network scrambled to reactivate Cold War orbital weapons, as city-sized ships broke through the edge of deep space radar like ghosts returning from myth, Kieran whispered the only truth that mattered now. We answered a joke, and now the punchline's here. But the story didn't end with their arrival. Because deep within the alien vessel's approach vector, a second human signal echoed back a one no one on Earth sent. And Kieran was about to uncover a secret that would shake everything he thought he knew about the origins of the message, a broken bar, and of humanity itself. They were already here. That was the truth no one had dared to speak. Not even Kirana, until the evidence screamed loud enough to break him. The alien vessels hadn't slowed. They hadn't sent a diplomat. They hadn't hailed Earth with grand declarations or cryptic riddles. They simply moved, precise, silent, watching. And as the massive dark geometry of their ships passed Neptune's orbit and warped closer, humanity's greatest minds scrambled for meaning, for pattern, for purpose. But Kieran, a broken bar, he found something else. The message Earth had received, the one hidden in the 1,000-year-old joke, the one that gave birth to the shield that saved the planet. It wasn't the first. It was just the first we decoded. In the hours following the flare, as Earth systems restabilized and data flooded back online, a burst transmission was uncovered buried beneath the Arctic ice, recorded in the 1960s, never translated, assumed to be interference from solar activity. But it wasn't noise, it was language, and it wasn't sent to Earth, it was sent from it. The glyphs were unmistakable, the linguistic symmetry, the mirrored cadence of the punchline, The embedded harmonic code, yeah, it was all the same. The joke had been told once before, not by aliens, but by someone on Earth, long before Kieran ever touched the monolith, and that changed everything. He ran the numbers again, chasing cold trails through abandoned government files, decommissioned radio logs, and classified SETI transcripts. Each piece formed a horrifying mosaic. Someone, somewhere, had already discovered the message before Hema and responded. A joke was sent back, a message saying, "We get it, we're ready." That reply wasn't public. It wasn't documented in history. It was buried, because the people who had responded back then had known what it would trigger. And now, decades later, the consequence had arrived. Kieran stood in front of a global broadcast again, not to warn, not to plead, but to reveal. The world needed to know that this encounter wasn't unexpected, that the countdown had always included an answer, planted not in humor, but in preparation. Earth hadn't simply stumbled into alien contact through comedy. It had been selected, coached, trained from the shadows. And the final horror, one of Earth's own secret agencies, long buried under layers of deniability, had spent decades preparing for this arrival, and not to defend, but to welcome. They believed the visitors weren't invaders, but architects, the original terraformers, our makers. Kieran's voice shook as he revealed the final line of the hidden message, uncovered just hours ago from a secure Antarctic base, written in both alien glyphs and ancient proto-human symbols. "We planted the fire so you would learn to survive. Now you must decide what to become." The solar flare wasn't an accident of nature. It was engineered. Earth's near annihilation was the final calibration, and the ships now descending weren't coming to destroy USA. They were coming to judge what their fire had made. Panic gave way to dread. Faith systems collapsed. Governments turned on their own archives, hunting for anyone who had known this was coming. And amid that storm of disbelief, Kieran prepared for his final move, because buried even deeper than all the data, hidden inside the framework of the joke's final cadence, was a third layer, a private cipher, not meant for governments, not meant for humanity. It was meant for one person, and the key to that message was in Kieran's blood. His DNA wasn't entirely human, and neither, it seemed, was the joke. It was always inside him, the rhythm of it, the cadence, the way the alien message folded language into laughter, logic into irony. It hadn't just matched his mind, it had resonated with something buried deeper than memory, something coded into his marrow. Kieran had assumed he was the one who discovered the joke, but now, as the alien vessels near the exosphere and encrypted patterns flared across global skywatch systems, the unbearable truth rose like a tide in his thoughts. He hadn't been chosen to decode the message, he had been engineered to deliver it. The third layer of the message, the cipher locked behind nested glyphs and phonetic equations, had refused to unlock. No quantum language models could solve it, until Kieran, drained and desperate, fed his own genetic code into the translation algorithm. The symbols rearranged instantly, fluid, alive, not just recognizing him but awaiting him. The message unfolded into clear instruction, coordinates, activation codes. A phrase pulsed and read across the decrypted feed. Echo initiator detected. Bioseed confirmed. Begin legacy reawakening. The echo wasn't metaphor, it was literal. Kieran wasn't a coincidence. He was a key part of a human bloodline seeded with dormant alien data, placed centuries ago to ensure that when the time came, someone would be able to understand. And now, the lock had turned. From the skies, the ships adjusted course, no longer drifting above cities or military bases. They aligned toward a specific node deep in the Peruvian Andes, ancient temple ground known for carvings and glyphs dismissed by mainstream science. But Kieran recognized them now. They weren't symbols, they were instructions. The flare, the joke, the shield, it was all part of a timed process, a test to see if Earth-seeded minds could survive and activate what came next. A global voice transmission broke into satellite feeds everywhere, not from any nation, from the ships. A single sentence, delivered in perfect human tone. "We left you gifts. You survived the fire. Now restore the bridge." The bridge. Kieran's breath caught. The Andes site wasn't just symbolic, it was an anchor, a gate, a relay point meant to reopen contact not just with the architects but with others like Earth, seeded across the stars, planets tested, civilizations refined through fire and silence, and Earth was the first to pass. Kieran's blood held the key to activating that bridge, but once activated, there was no turning back. Humanity would be visibly, fully, undeniably to the wider galactic intelligence that had built these systems, these trials, this strange cruel humor wrapped in survival and design. He stood at the heart of the ancient site, its stones already glowing, activated by proximity to his presence. The pattern in the floor was identical to the joke's syntax. Sarcasm turned sacred geometry, mockery turned map. And as he placed his hand into the final stone lock, a hum began. The sky cracked open, and not in violence, but in transition. A light formed above him, not a weapon, a gateway, and through it, distant stars blinked unto terrifying clarity. Planets not yet known, civilizations not yet named, echoes of others like him who had survived, who had laughed at death and passed the test. Kieran turned toward the crowd behind him. Scientists, soldiers, survivors saw and spoke just 3 words: "We're not alone." And though the world below him still trembled from the memory of fire, something in the air had changed. The test was over. Now came the invitation. The sky was no longer blue. Above the Andes, where ancient stones hummed with forgotten energy and alien frequencies vibrated through the bones of the earth, the rift had stabilized. A tear in Spacia, smooth, spiraling, not chaotic but crafted, hovered like a second sun, radiating no heat, only intent. This was not a storm. This was a welcome. And Kieran told, his blood now recognized across light years, stood at its center as both messenger and message. He was no longer just a man who had cracked a cosmic joke. He was living proof that humanity was not an accident of biology but a project, one seeded with potential, forged in trial. And now a broken bar summoned. The gateway pulsed once more, and then something passed through. Not ships, not armies, a structure geometric, translucent, far too massive to be called a beacon, yet too precise to be organic. It hovered above the earth, vast and impossibly quiet. Inside it, layers rotated like a living mechanism. Light passed through it like memory, and from its core came a transmission, and not in sound, but in shared thought. Every mind on earth, every human, whether a child in Nairobi or a physicist in Oslo, felt it like a whisper against their soul. Phase 1, complete. What followed was not explanation, but exposure. In dreams, in waking visions, in sudden bursts of memory, fragments of alien thought began to flood the minds of Earth's population. Ideas never before conceived, equations far beyond modern science, language born not from words, but from vibration. Images of planets burned clean by flares and then rebuilt by hands made of light. Civilizations that did not die but ascended. Kieran collapsed to his knees. Overwhelmed by the download, he saw not just the origin of the joke but the purpose of it. Humor, irony, satire. These weren't tools of entertainment. They were filters of consciousness, a way to detect pattern recognition not just in logic, but in emotion. The architects had searched for worlds capable of laughter because laughter meant contradiction. It meant duality. It meant sentience advanced enough to doubt its own end. And Earth had doubted. Humanity had survived. And now, it would evolve. But not all were ready. As the vision washed across the world, fear spread in pockets. Religious factions called it a false rapture. Governments panicked at their powerlessness. Weapons were primed in secret. Protocols written for contact were finally deployed too late. The architects had bypassed diplomacy, bypassed politics, bypassed hierarchy. Their message went to the species as a whole, and Kieran understood why. Because this was not first contact, it was final confirmation. The monoliths across the globe, some ancient, some newly awakened, began to rise from under oceans, beneath deserts, within Arctic shelves, all pulsing the same tone, all built long ago by unknown machines that had buried them for this moment. Together, they formed a network, and from that network came a countdown. Not a threat, a choice. 72 hours, one decision. Stay stay as you area or accept what you were built to become. Transformation or resistance, evolution or extinction. Kieran stood once more, feeling the resonance of the bridge inside his own bones. He knew what Earth had to do, knew what he had to do, because the next phase wouldn't be activated by systems or weapons or code. It required a human voice, and as the Earth held its breath, as billions struggled with awe and terror, Kieran stepped into the light of the structure, lifted his head, and laughed, not from amusement, but from understanding. And with that final, perfect echo of humanity's strangest gift, a broken bar, the transformation began. The moment Kieran laughed, it echoed through the structure, not as sound, but as vibration. The gateway pulsed once, like a living heart responding to a stimulus it had waited centuries to hear. Across the world, the dormant monoliths shuddered in unison. Earth itself seemed to pause. And then, with impossible precision, the transformation began. It didn't start with fire or light. It began with understanding, a shift in perception so subtle, most didn't notice it up until they looked at the sky. Not just through their eyes, but through something deeper. Where once there was darkness, they now sensed design. Stars didn't just shimmer, they pulsed in deliberate rhythm. The air no longer simply moved up, it communicated. The joke, once hidden in a 1,000-year-old punchline, had become a universal language. Earth had spoken it. Now, the galaxy was answering back. Inside the structure above the Andes, Kieran's body was suspended midair, bathed in rotating spirals of information. Symbols wrapped around him, not to harm, but to integrate. His DNA was no longer just a biological blueprint. It was a key activating dormant circuits, not just in himself, but across humanity. The architects hadn't come to conquer. They had come to awaken what they had once planted, and it had begun. All over the planet, the awakened emerged. People who could now hear the monoliths, feel the pulse beneath the crust, sense the symmetry in chaos. They weren't gifted or chosen, they were simply ready. From farmers to coders, prisoners to monks, as something inside them aligned with the frequency of the message. Kieran was no longer alone. Earth's real legacy, long buried under war, greed, and denial, had started to rise. But not everyone welcomed it. Fear spread quickly through the old powers. Military forces launched black ops to disable monoliths. Satellites were realigned to blast the gate with focused TMPs. Nuclear submarines were given untraceable orders. But it was too late. The signal had already routed itself in the biosphere, in the oceans, in the soil. Earth had become part of the network. Still, humanity had a choice. That was the final gift in the Jokia consent. The transformation wouldn't be forced. It had to be chosen, by each soul, by each mind. The countdown wasn't a doomsday clock. It was a threshold. At the end of 72 hours, the bridge would close, and Earth would either rise to join the architects among the stars, or remain isolated to broken bar, silent, until the next flare, the next joke, the next chance. And so the world divided not in violence, but in belief. Some built temples beneath the monoliths, begging for elevation. Others fled into deep bunkers, praying for the silence to return. But those who stood still, who listened with hearts open and minds quiet, a broken bar, they began to change. They saw glimpses of other worlds, cities that floated on air, civilizations where thought sculpted matter, and most powerfully, they saw Earth not as it was, but as it could be. Kieran, still suspended in the core of the structure, became the voice for all who had chosen transformation, a conduit between what humanity had been and what it was becoming. And with every breath, he heard not commands, but stories from worlds that had faced their own flares, their own trials. Some had succeeded, others had not. In the final hours, silence fell again. Not out of fear, out of reverence. Billions sat quietly, holding their breath and not waiting for salvation, but for resonance. Would they become more than flesh and fear, or would they retreat back into the comfort of forgetting? As the clock neared its final second, the sky lit with a pulse that rippled across the oceans, carved itself into clouds, and echoed into the bones of every mountain. A choice had been made, and as the light embraced the world, one final voice rang out, in not Kieran's, but the architect's, "Welcome back." And in that moment, Humanity remembered what it had always been meant to become. The light did not blind it, revealed. It swept across Earth like a tide of memory returning home. Trees shimmered with echoes of ancient code. Mountains thrummed with frequencies once buried beneath layers of forgotten time. And humanity awoke. Those who had chosen the transformation didn't descend in fire or vanish into light. They simply shifted. Their eyes, once clouded by limits of biology, now saw the hidden lattice of energy flowing through the world. Their minds, once tethered to fear, expanded to perceive meaning in chaos, unity in contradiction. They felt time not as a line, but as a pulse. They didn't become gods. They became aware of the truth that had always lived beneath the static of their existence. But with the transformation came memory, and not just their own, but shared recollections from across the stars. They saw how the architects had traveled from galaxy to galaxy, seeding jokes as keys, challenges as invitations. They didn't build empires, they built bridges. The solar flare wasn't meant to destroy Earth, it was designed to temper it, to prepare the species for contact without conquest, for unity without erasure. Kieran stood in the center of the activation chamber, no longer suspended but walking freely, rebuilt, reborn, yet still unmistakably human. The structure around him began to dissolve, its task completed, its purpose fulfilled. No ships landed, no thrones were offered, no chains were given. The architects had given Earth the most alien gift possible, choice. Above, the sky no longer burned, it shimmered like a window waiting to be stepped through. Through the gate, other worlds now responded. Some sent pulses of color, others shared harmonic waves, laughter encoded in mathematics. A choir of civilizations that had all once stood where Earth had stood, staring at a flare, decoding a joke, making a decision. But even as Earth took its place in the greater network, not all humans transformed. Many chose to remain. They would not be punished. Their story would continue, organic, unpredictable, beautiful in its own imperfection. And the transformed would not leave them behind. The future would not be divided between higher and lower, ascended and left behind. It would be shared by those who chose to awaken and those who chose to wait. The countdown ended not in apocalypse, but an invitation fulfilled. And in the final scene, as the first Earth-built craft guided by both human innovation and architect knowledge pierced the edge of the gate and entered the deep unknown, Kieran's voice transmitted one last message to the planet he loved. We survived the fire, we understood the joke, and now a broken bar we write the next one. A pulse echoed through the stars. Earth was no longer a question, it had become an answer.